Welcome to Living in the Matrix. I'm Jonathan, and I'm left of center.
And I'm Rich, and I tend to lean a little bit more to the right. But the bottom line is together we try to look for the balance of what it means to be human in today's world.
So I'm glad that I were able to do this because I've known you so long and I followed your journey, and I loved what you're doing with this book. So let's get started. Welcome to Living in the Matrix. I'm Jonathan, and today we unfortunately don't have Rich. He's away with his bride on a anniversary weekend. Today, I have a longtime friend who named Joseph Myers. He has just written a book called Trust. And Joseph, I will let you kind of unpack your book, but I have followed Joseph's journey because I was in the emerging church conversation, and Joseph was the center point of that. He was a vocal voice within that movement. And we've kind of kept touch and base over the last 15 years. So I'm super excited to unpack this book. Joseph, welcome. It's good to have you,
Thank
man.
you. It's really good to be with you, Jonathan, and to be able to catch up and talk, about this journey that brought about this book. It's
Absolutely. So what's the
been a
name of your
long
book?
time. Say that again.
What's the name of your book?
It's called Trust Me, Discovering Trust in a Culture of Distrust.
Okay. The title of a book is always a very long conversation. How did you get to that title? And were there any other versions that you considered?
Yeah, actually, there's because of the journey to communicate with a publisher, it makes it more complex. It's not just your title any longer.
Right.
When a publisher grabs a hold of a book, they have expertise, and I'm not going to take all that away from them. And then they have an
Right.
audience that they feel like they know best. And
Mm-hmm.
so, um, fortunately, Trust Me has always been the working title for me. We
Okay.
did consider a few other titles. There's a big portion of the book that talks about the trust flywheel. And so, is it more compelling to call it the trust flywheel?
Mm-hmm.
And so, all along, there's been 2 or 3 versions and probably 8 versions of the subtitle. But quite honestly, the first title was Trust Me, and the first subtitle was Discovering Trust in a Culture of Distrust. So it kind of
Okay.
went full circle back to what I had chosen literally in the mid 80s, way back in the 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a weird journey.
What did the publisher want?
They love Trust Me. And
Okay.
so I actually was
Did that always
fighting.
stay? Did the first part always stay and you kind of were always wrangling over the subtitle? Is that what was happening?
No, I actually, because I can write this, um, because I have a unique relationship with the publisher. They only wanted rights for distribution into the K through 12 market.
Okay.
And I, of course, with all my books, even The Search to Belong, it was never, when I started researching The Search to Belong and talking about it, it was never really to a religious audience. That's not what I was writing for or even researching for. But once a
Who is your
publisher,
audience?
say that again,
Who is your audience?
for a search,
Yeah.
yeah, I just wanted it to be more of a self-help, general kind of how do people belong, and not really connected to any kind of thing like a religious conversation about small groups. I,
Yeah.
it obviously went in that direction because the publisher needed it to go in that direction. And
Yeah.
it's kind of the same with Trust Me. It has examples that are education based, but the entirety of the book is even more closely, or let me say, more further away from that target audience than Search.
Mm-hmm.
Search really was written to the small group movement, where Trust Me only has examples that come from classroom and or administration. But then I was, to get back to the title, I really was trying to fight for something else because I thought the Trust Me title was a really good one for a general audience.
Hmm.
And I have the rights to publish in a general audience over and above what I've done. So, anyway, all that to be said, the publisher really loved the title. Trust me, that's what they fell in love with before they even heard the concepts, and so that's what we went with.
That's awesome because I know the burden of the publisher. So I started a publishing company back in 2009. We ended up publishing 37 books, and the journey of like the birth to the completion of the book is a long, arduous path because it really starts when the birth of the idea happens, and there's what the writer thinks, and then there's what the publisher adds. Like you said, they're pros, they have data about the audience so they can help shape it. But at what point does it stop being your idea? Did you ever feel like that in writing this book that it was losing, or were they like fully behind you?
No, they were fully behind me. I never felt
That's
like,
awesome.
and even yeah, even with Search, I never felt like it wasn't my book. Um,
Good.
yeah, I really don't mind voices
Hmm.
um, kind of influencing or helping or guiding, as long as the core ideas remain the core ideas and true
Hmm.
to the research that I've done. I'm pretty open to, well, let's go this way with it. I'm like, all right,
Right.
what do I
Because
know?
what's interesting is your book is about trusting and the nature of a relationship with your writer and a publisher and editor. So it's a trifecta and a marketing guy. It's like this family, and you've got to trust that the vision is held by you, but is shaped a little by better everybody else.
That's right. Yeah, it's a collaborative piece, and always, and it always helps me to continue to remember this isn't a living document; it's a snapshot.
Yeah.
And so there's many things that I've learned since I wrote Search. There'll be many things that I already know, and it's only been out a few months that I know, uh, and I don't really kind of regret that what I've learned now isn't in the
Hmm.
book. It was a snapshot
Right.
of a time, and
Right.
we got it down, and we'll move on.
Is there a volume two, or do you think this book's closed?
No, I think that there's at least a volume two.
Okay. Nice. So let's break down your book. What is your book about? You shared a little bit with me, but how would you break it down to an audience?
Yeah, so it really began. This I think it's helpful to understand the book through
Hmm.
the lens of where the concept came from. So in the mid '80s, I was married and had separated from my wife, and we were having discussions that were not very beneficial. And she would show up, and eventually the words would come out of her mouth. I just don't trust you. I can't trust you any
Hmm.
longer. I can't trust you with anything. And there'd be crying, yelling, screaming, all those wonderful joys of going through separation. And at the her very next action would be to hand over a little hand holding a My Little Pony suitcase, our little 1 year old daughter. And instead of concentrating on the hurt and pain, I just found it overly interesting that here's someone who claims no trust at all, zero, and maybe even
Hmm.
negative, handing over her most prized possession. That was very interesting to me. And so when I
What do
started
you mean by
thinking
that?
through,
What do you mean by that? That she handed over to you?
yeah, so for our
Was this
daughter,
her
so,
daughter? Was it your
and
daughter, or
my
did she just have
and my daughter,
custody?
right? No,
Got it.
so we at this time we're just separated. There's no custody. There's
Got it.
no, and so it's our daughter, 1 year old daughter, and she's handing over this most prized possession for the weekend, kind of thing, or maybe
Hmm.
an evening for the during the week or whatever it was.
Okay.
That's so interesting to me. And so early on, I started thinking, well, trust and distrust have to be two separate concepts if that's the case. They
Hmm.
can't be as attached as what we believe they are. And then I started doing all this research, and all I found was basically the same thing that I had learned as a kid, which is the more you trust, the less you distrust, and vice versa. But when I started looking through this lens that trust and distrust were two separate things, I saw it all over that people were able to hold a great amount of distrust and a great amount of trust at the exact same time.
Hmm.
Well, about 6 years ago, neuroscience, through several different studies, none of them about trust, but a part of what their finding was is that distrust is processed in the amygdala. So distrust
Hmm.
is a fight, flight, freeze response,
Okay.
and trust is processed in the prefrontal cortex. It's a part of our executive thinking. So, simply said,
That's
we
fascinating.
yeah. So, but simply said, we decide to trust and we feel distrust, and so in our heads we process it as two separate concepts.
But I don't know if the general public understands what you mean by that, because we kind of think of distrust and trust as opposite sides of the coin, and they're actually completely different functions. They're not just opposite sides of the coins. They're complete. What does that mean to you? What break that down simply why that's important?
Yeah. So, the amygdala is responsible for keeping you safe. That's all
Right.
it's there for, keep you safe. So, whenever I'm triggered to distrust, what that means is I'm trying to keep a piece of me or my point of view of the world safe. And what is that? Unlike
Hmm.
when I'm engaging in trust, which is a decision making process in the prefrontal cortex. Because the
Hmm.
prefrontal cortex, all it's good for, not all, but what is primary is it's trying to build relationship between things. It's trying to make sense of the world by bringing things together. So, what that means to me is um, if you are trying to develop trust with only one tool set, you are leaving out at least half of the equation. Meaning, to really develop trust in your life and in organizations or in a team, you must have a tool set that mitigates distrust and then a separate tool set that engages trust. So
That
a lot of these trust systems really, a lot of them engage in activities that mitigate distrust, and they
Mhm.
forget that trust is a relational decision. But they're constantly mitigating distrust, so it feels like that I'm trusting you more if I mitigate my distrust.
But here's what I think people do is they feel distrust and make the decision that I can't trust, thereby
Yeah,
closing off that option. It turns off the prefrontal
exactly.
cortex and says, fuck you. No way. I am going to protect myself. And a lot of people don't understand that. That's why they're not opposite sides of the coins, they're separate functions. So if you get into a state of distrust, it doesn't mean you can't trust. It means that your amygdala is telling your prefrontal cortex not to trust.
That's
That is
exactly
so
it.
fascinating. Yeah.
That's exactly it. And one of the best
And
things
that
to know about
paralyzes
your
us. That
yes,
paralyzes us.
completely. I
Yeah.
mean, just think of our political system right now and how we
Hmm.
market our political system. So
Yes.
what we know in marketing is it's much easier to get you to distrust than to go through the pains of trying to get you to make a decision to trust.
Hmm.
So therefore, if I'm a political candidate, my real job in marketing is to get you to distrust my opponent. I really don't need you to trust me. I need you to distrust them.
Wow. That's
So
interesting.
that's much
I've
easier
never
to do.
heard that. I've never heard that. That's fascinating. Why that kind of changes how you can look at marketing about it's rare because I worked in Hollywood. When I finished film school, I went and worked in commercials, and I saw a lot of the machinations of that. And I think it's gotten slicker now, but the idea is it's easier to say don't like your competitor than it is to say why we are good. That's
That's right.
fascinating. Yes.
Now,
And
it's
that
not
it
it doesn't create loyalty. It just gets
yes.
you to act like a single action like voting.
Yeah, but the first mover of whatever is your first choice has a natural advantage.
That's
Something
right.
drew you to them.
That's right.
And so that's interesting because it's in marketing. I've never heard of that tactic. That's quite but I love what you're doing because you've created this dichotomy between not it's not a dichotomy, it's two separate functions that the brain, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are almost in this diametric war of who's going to be in control.
Yeah, they
And I
can be.
think,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I
What's
think the amygdala is meant to serve the prefrontal cortex, but if it's in control, it will never give up control.
That's it. So what I
Yeah.
say is that the amygdala has two different personalities.
Okay.
One
Interesting.
is a guard dog barking and biting, and one is a guide dog navigating risk. And if
Okay.
you can get your amygdala to take on context. So for instance, there's a bear rushing me. My amygdala is automatically, because it doesn't reason, it's automatically
Mhm.
going to run, right? It's going to make me scared in a fight, flight, or freeze response, right? So,
Okay.
but if I bring in context to that and I say, wait a minute, I'm at the zoo and there's a chasm and a fence between us. There's no way that bear's going to harm me. I still might flinch, but I'm not going to run away, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And so, as soon as we can bring context to our amygdala, and that happens in another part of the brain, it's called the orthofrontal cortex. It sits right next to the amygdala, and it brings context to the amygdala. Well, if you can
Okay.
use that to actually inform your amygdala that there's context here, and you probably aren't in the danger that you think you're in, then you can use your amygdala as a friend to your prefrontal cortex, and it can be a guide dog and help navigate the risk that you're about to take.
Wow. Wow. The relationship of that, when you see the fence, is that a executive function?
It's it's
Like to
it wouldn't
create the
be
context, is that
yeah,
part of
it
the
wouldn't
executive
be
function?
really an executive function because it happens in that orthofrontal cortex.
Okay, so
It's
it happens next to the amygdala. Got it.
yeah. Now, the prefrontal cortex, if it's allowed to, if it's robust enough, if it's had a good relationship with the amygdala over your lifetime, yes, it can really inform
Interesting.
the amygdala and help it get to that guide dog state. So,
And
yes,
what I hear you saying is, I the amygdala, when it's in quality relationship with the prefrontal cortex, you have a good life. And when you don't, you don't. Is that what
that's
you're
right.
saying?
Well, a good
Yeah.
life. Let me just say that there are times we need our amygdala to stand up and
Hmm.
bark. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
someone's got a knife when we're in true danger, whether that's
Hmm.
physical or mental or psychological, we need our amygdala to be healthy enough to bark and bite. No
Hmm.
doubt about it.
But
But
when
it's
we get stuck, we need to learn how to get out of it. You can live with any conflict for any moment,
that's
but
right.
you can't live with the outcome, that emotion forever. You can't
That's right.
live like that. To live in a survival state. I lived for 12 years after my divorce in a survival state.
Yeah.
And you don't see it when you're in it because you're largely protective. Like I used to remember when I lost my job, my kids, and my house all in the same weekend.
Yeah. Me too.
Okay. And then I
Very.
ended up living with my sister for a year and a half while I rebuilt my life. And I remember going, holy shit, I am I'm a piece of shit. You self-judge yourself. You can't help it. And I just went into the survival state going, am I going to be able to make enough money to take care of my kids? Because they had lived a certain way for most of their life. And all of a sudden that was just out the window. So it was
Right.
interesting. I went into survival state and came out of that last summer. You
Wow.
don't see the survival state when you're in it because it's part of your survival.
That's right.
Yeah. So what was the catalyst for you writing this book? Where did that begin?
Well, like I said, in the mid '80s is when I started really researching. And I thought I would write a book pretty soon after that. In fact, I've been thinking
Mm-hmm.
about this long before I thought about Search to Belong. Search to Belong came out in 2003, and so
Mm-hmm.
I had a good
Which
20
which to my
years.
listeners, Search to Belong is an amazing book. I loved your book. But it was at a right time for us. We were both part of the emerging church, and I think we were looking for a space where we did belong because we weren't finding it in the system we had lived in, you know?
Right,
And
right.
your book was fantastic. So,
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's taken on a life of its own, and which
yeah.
is just amazing. But I've been thinking about this 20 years before I thought about
Okay.
Search to Belong. But I could never, me, Jonathan, I really contemplate and make sure that hopefully what I'm saying has a real basis and foundation of truth,
Mm-hmm.
as much
Yes.
truth as what we know at the
Yes.
time. So when I
I
wrote
don't think you
Search,
would let yourself release any other type of book,
right? No, when I wrote the Search,
you know?
I am confident that those are four space, so I needed to be confident that these two things were separate, and I wasn't finding um, literally anybody saying the same thing. And so the catalyst was as soon as I was living in Canada at the time, working at a film studio, and I read this report, and I'm like, "You've got to be kidding me!" And it just came. I'm fascinated with brain science, so and it had just released, and then like four others released right after that, saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, finally,
Yeah.
I have the context, the research behind me to say this is the way the brain is processing trust and distrust, and this is why that's really important.
Okay. So, what I hear you saying is you had the idea and then the science discovered your idea. Is
Yeah,
that what you're
well,
saying?
at least my observations. My observations was
No, yeah.
where people were, yeah, they were
You put
using
it
trust
together
and
in
distrust.
your head. Yeah. You
Yes,
put it
right,
together in your head and it made sense in your head. And then the science just came along and said, oh, we agree with you.
right, exactly.
That's fantastic. So where did it grow from there? When did it become a real project for you?
Hmm.
Have you been kind of churning notes for a long time, or did it just pop and just birth?
No, I have a whole big filing cabinet drawer full of meanderings and writings and research and everything that I could, images and all kinds of stuff that I gathered over the years that I had to once literally the day I read the research, I went home and I'm like, I've got to write this book now. And then I looked at all the crap that I had gathered, and I'm like, oh, this is going to take me 80 years more to get through this stuff and write a book on it. Thankfully, it didn't. It only took me a few, but um, yeah, it. So forming it, as you know, forming a concept like this and then writing it into a book is just a process of editing. What shouldn't I
Yeah.
say? What should not be in the book? Um,
Hmm.
those kinds of things. How can I make it simpler? How can I, those kinds of things are a part of all that process.
So when did you put pen to paper, or fingers to keystrokes? When did that start?
In earnest, as far as categorized into chapters and those kinds of things,
Yeah,
I
because
would
that's
say
I can easily get stuck in the note department. It's when it begins to organize itself. That's when you know the book is beginning to birth. And that's because that's the
Yeah,
real hard. The gathering is anything can be relevant, but to take it and funnel it down into the distillation of this idea that has to grow, you got to convince your audience. You've got to think through all the logical fallacies. When you're making an argument like that, it's a tough process because you want it to be valuable.
that's right.
So, how did that work out
And
for you?
yeah, so it once it formed into chapters, and I had along the way I had written list of chapter ideas. So basically, I finally came down to saying, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to gather all these chapter title ideas, and I'm
Mhm.
going to see if there's themes that have matured and come out of that.
Yeah.
And so then that really, it kind of solidified pretty early. And I would say I've been writing it for about 2.5 years. The chapters came together
Mhm.
about 2.5 years ago, and it's so interesting because ever since the beginning of that chapter categorization, I wanted one of the chapters to be the last chapter. I was
Okay.
so dead set on it, and at the very last second, it just didn't make sense, and it didn't become the
Ah.
last chapter. It became one of the other chapters. So it's, as you know, it's just that weird process. And um, let me just say, writing a book is a process of learning to trust and distrust
Mhm.
yourself in healthy ways.
Yeah, because you put like everybody feels writer's block because in what I think is the writer's block is you're just self-judging yourself before you even start, and
Right.
it keeps you from having to face that you suck because every writer sucks when they start unless you're a genius. And that process is like there's an editor in there. And when I was publishing books, I would tell people, turn off the editor. You cannot be a good writer until you turn it off, because some of the stuff that you're going to write isn't going to be good, but some of it might be really good. And the more you churn on it, but if you never get it down on paper, it's you're never going to be able to build a book,
Yeah,
you
it's
know?
never a book, right? Yeah, and for me, it was shutting off the barking guard dog. I think
Yeah.
for me, writer's
Mhm.
block is that barking guard dog saying,
Yeah.
I'm trying to keep you safe because you don't want to make an idiot of yourself.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, we don't want to. It's interesting as I just sit here with your idea of the amygdala versus the prefrontal cortex. It's just such a strange relationship. And as a writer, you can't write a book without the prefrontal cortex. So you kind of got to give it control. And that's sort of, you've illustrated the life of a writer by your book. It's you've
Yeah, right.
created this idea of, because you think about it in the creation of the book, it's like, oh my God, I have a great idea. No, it's going to suck if you release it. There's this inner dialogue that happens. And that's now between your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex. I love that idea because the writer is like, let me ask you a question. Do you
Yeah.
think the amygdala is just about safety? And I know the default mode network is primarily around identity, but the amygdala is just around safety.
Yes, and
Okay.
it's core to understand that because, for instance, I'm working with a lot of people now, using my concepts as a plug-in to, let's say, Clifton Strengths. Some kind of
Mhm.
personality profile,
Okay.
and what your personality does is it will inform you at what things will speed up your trust and distrust.
Mhm.
So my Clifton strengths, my top five. One of the things I know about me is that what triggers me 90% of the time to distrust is when I feel like I'm losing control.
Okay.
That is at the core of my personality. Is I
Mhm.
need control, and whenever that emerges that I feel like someone else is trying to control me, I
Hmm.
will instantly go into barking and biting because that's shaking the fence at my core, right? And so it really is valuable to understand that the amygdala and distrust, its only job is trying to keep you safe. So
Hmm.
when you start distrusting, the best question you can ask is, what don't I feel safe about? What about this situation or this person is making me feel unsafe? And then can I describe that in a word or two? And then to ask, after you figure that out, is to ask, am are they really trying to control me?
Hmm.
Is that a
Well, that's the thing
reality?
is the amygdala has to develop a history.
Yes.
And Rich and I always talk about this, that history is your ledger. It's a comparative element to say for each person, can I trust this person? Is it on the positive or the negative? That's why we want to keep that ledger, because it gives us what we need to make that assessment. And it's very destructive because we get it wrong a lot.
A lot.
Like a lot. Like we talked about in a previous episode, 84% of your worry never comes true. Like that's 3/4 of your life or 4/5 of your life. That's crazy.
It's crazy. And it all develops, like you said, from that amygdala
Yeah.
who is just trying to keep you safe from something.
Yeah.
And yet, it formed to basically keep you physically safe. But now
Hmm.
we're not in a world that most of us have to be concerned about our physical safety 99.9% of the time. So, what does it need to work for? Well, there's other things that it'd like to pay attention to. And it's really difficult, I think, if you don't categorize these two things, trust and distrust. And I
Hmm.
think there's other things, but if you don't
Yeah.
categorize them into separate processes, you'll never get to the core of why your amygdala is acting the way it is in your specific situation.
Yeah. You can't release it. If you
You
don't
can't.
do the work, you can't release it. That's the problem. Is it's not a religious thing, it's not a moral thing, it's
No.
a mental health thing.
Right.
Human beings are constantly stuck in a mental health problem that is easy to fix but hard to discover.
Yeah.
It hides, and it's and this is where it goes off into philosophical and religious conversations, because I think Jesus got that. I think Jesus got that it was a mental health issue. It's going on in here. He
Yeah.
could see that. And he realized you got to start by loving yourself. And if you don't love yourself, you'll never discover what's wrong with you, to
Yeah.
heal what's wrong with you so that you can realize, oh, there is life. So I think that's why this concept of trust is at the center point. I don't know if it's love or trust, if they're the same thing, because I think trust is sort of the physical embodiment of love. And that's the center point where everybody's trying to get to, but they live stuck on the other pole,
Yeah.
you know?
And
Like
let
they
me just
can't get to trust because they're so stretched apart. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, because their amygdala is blocked. Their all their. I mean, the
Yeah.
amygdala has the power in the
Mhm.
brain to shut it completely down. It has that power, and it's so interesting
Yeah.
that we're made that way. Um,
So for our listeners, explain that. So that's sort of when people are blacking out. The amygdala takes total control and turns your executive function off. Explain that process.
yeah, so I'm not sure that I'm qualified to explain the whole process, but
But in
it's
layman's
definitely
terms of how you understand it. It's
yeah,
all we need.
it's a chemical um, action where when our amygdala gets into hijack and it gets to barking and biting,
Mhm.
it needs all the calories it can to be
Yeah.
centered around feeding it physiologically so that it can keep you safe. And so it will
Hmm.
shut down literally the rest of your brain. So again, think about our political situation because it's easy to see in this environment. Hardly any a lot of people will say, aren't isn't there anyone out there who's thinking? No, because we are stuck in amygdala hijack a lot of times when it comes to whatever we're thinking politically. And all of a sudden, no one's got executive thought here. We're all reacting out of our amygdala. And that's an overstatement.
It's a survival statement or a survival state, though. I think
Yeah.
collectively we're in a survival state because if you think back about, it's probably about 15 or 20 years, you or I are in that generation. The birth of the internet, which led to AI in the last year, is this center point of where humans have almost been spun so far out with learning and having too much information. We're all living in the same survival state
Yes.
and we're stuck.
We just and we don't. We're stuck in an environment where we don't have time to literally process.
Yeah.
So we live on fear cycles, not news cycles.
What do you mean
Um,
by that?
we no longer have news cycles. That's a thing of the past. It went away probably when Walter Cronkite died. I don't know.
Oh, news
Yeah,
cycles. Got it.
news. Yeah.
Okay.
So um, n- news organizations aren't dependent on news coming out. They're
Mhm.
dependent on how can I create fear around this one, whatever it is, and how long can we stretch that
Mhm.
out until the amygdala gets tired of being so ramped up about it, and now we got to find something else to build fear around.
Yeah. Social media is the exact same way in that
Same thing.
it's Facebook's algorithm is dialed to conflict. The
Yes.
more conflict you're engaged in, whether or not you started it, is that's where it will drive you. It will try and give you situations that are going to create conflict for you.
Right. And one of the problems is that our brain is wired for story, right? And you don't have a story unless you have conflict. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of people talk about, story is character based or it's narrative based, whatever it is. No, it's conflict based. You don't have a story until you have a conflict. And
Yeah.
so our whole wiring is to be attracted to that.
Hmm. Why do you think that is?
I don't know.
It's one of those questions that can just linger in the air and nobody really knows how to answer it. It's
Yeah, I mean,
it's
one of the coolest. So forever, I've been a Winnie the Pooh fan.
oh
I,
really?
I I've read Winnie the Pooh for years and years and years, like a chapter a night out of the Winnie the Pooh, volumes. And one of the most fascinating things I found about it is Winnie the Pooh doesn't have an antagonist. It's a whole story without
Mm,
conflict.
mm. I've never known that, and as you were saying Winnie the Pooh, I was thinking of my own experiences. Going, I don't have a single bad experience with Winnie the Pooh. It's just so wholesome, and that is a great way that you broke it down. He doesn't have an enemy. He has nobody to worry about. That's
None.
none. Yeah, that's the kingdom of God. I think. I think that's
Yeah,
what all enlightened avatars are trying to get to. It's just
that's
we don't
exactly
need
it.
enemies. Yeah,
Right.
it's all made up.
Yeah. It's all the Garden of Eden, right?
Yeah.
It's all.
So how did this so far how has this book affected you
Hmm.
as a human being? Because I know you're a deep person and you're a thinker. You really ponder things. How has this book affected you?
I would say that mainly, and over this has just been over the years.
Hmm.
Um, I've learned I've learned to trust myself more and more, and not be. Well, that's the first thing. Um, I think for years I lived with and this sounds so weird, but I think that I've lived with the fear that one, other people are going to control me, and
Hmm.
I just can't do that,
Yeah,
and that I am not trustworthy to control myself. And
that's
that's really having those two things and then trying
mhm.
to work through the whole idea that now I know. in my brain and the way it processes trust and distrust,
Mhm.
that I can have a healthy distrust for myself. That it's okay for me to distrust pieces of myself or whatever, as long as it's guiding me through risk and not barking and biting and hijacked.
Hmm.
I'm really good with that.
What do you mean by healthy risk? I think that's or a healthy distrust. That's a really good distinction because you're not saying that when you look at yourself, you're this horrible beast. It's much more redemptive. Or pick a better word, but it feels like you're softening on your own stance of how. Because I know that feeling. There was a point in my life where I thought the only thing that made rational sense was to end my life because I couldn't
Mhm.
trust myself. I was constantly burying myself in problems that were self created. And I was self destructive. So understand what you're saying in terms of not being able to trust yourself. How did you get out of that pit?
Yeah, and I'm not even sure I'm out of it yet. Quite honest, but I'm at least
Mhm.
discovering that my amygdala is it's a superhero, that it's so important for my trust. Meaning, before it was either barking, biting dog, guard dog,
Mhm.
distrust, like you're awful, or it was this blind trust, like, oh, I can
Mhm.
do anything, I can do everything, I can handle this problem on my own, whatever. And so it's this blind
Right.
trusting of myself, and both of those got me in trouble. So
Mhm.
where's the in between? If they're on the same scale and they're not two separate things, there is no hope. You absolutely are just caught in between two things where you're like, that I just may be crazy and I can't do this any longer. And so the idea for me to be able to separate those and say, what I
Mhm.
need to do is distrust myself differently, and I need that to be a guide for my trusting myself. Like I know that there's stories that
Mhm.
I tell myself about relationships, specifically, marriage relationships, because I've been through a few, and so
Mhm.
it comes down to, it can't be the other person's fault three or four times. There's got to be, I've got to at least contribute to this problem. And what has happened to me is, when I get in those cycles where my guard dog is starting to bark and bite in a way that says, you know what, maybe you should get out of this relationship, and this is the quickest way to do that. I know that I can bring context to that and say, I'm being afraid that someone's trying to control me right now. And because I fear that, and is that really realistic? And I have to say, no, that's not realistic. They're not trying to control me.
Mhm.
They're trying to love me. Oh, now I can use that fear. I can use that distrust to now start trusting again. Not blindly trusting, because there might be
Mhm.
times where somebody is trying to control me, but that's not usually the case. Is that helpful?
Yeah, so you've learned to develop a conversation with yourself
Yes.
on the realities. It sounds like you're willing to face the truth about yourself and say, okay, we know all that stuff. So where do we go from here? Do you want to keep distrusting or do you want to keep trusting? It's a dialogue you're having with yourself. And I think here's what's interesting is when we go into those triggers, because triggers happen all the time, the rare moments when we're traumatized don't happen very often. It's the triggers that kill us because
Yeah,
they're constant darts. They happen. And then we go, oh shit, it's the first 90 seconds where you've got to learn to retrain your brain. You've got to learn to breathe through it because you're going to feel it. You cannot, so your brain sends the electrical signal down to your heart and it creates a chemical reaction that your body can't stop. You can't stop feeling the way you are. And you
that's
get
right.
stuck because it sends the signal back and says, oh shit. And that's the next 90 seconds, your life is offline. And if you can learn to breathe through it, It sounds like those you've developed this dialogue. How'd you learn to do that? Like, where did that come from?
I'm just going to say it's from the research of how do you calm your trigger? How do you then talk? What are the specific words that I need to talk to my amygdala? And for me, again, I come down to it's about someone trying to control me. 90% when I'm triggered, I can just tell you it's about me feeling like someone's trying to take over.
Mhm. So what you said
Uh,
earlier is it's always about something you're afraid of. And then the work is uncovering what that specific thing is so you can face it. How often are you able to get that far where you can be present with that fear and sit with it? Because that's tough work to do.
it is, and I'm not going to be over boastful about this because it'll happen as soon as we get off this call.
Hmm.
The I really feel at this point in my life that I'm about 70% where, and what has and literally,
Hmm.
Jonathan, what has really helped me is being able to boil it down to one word. Like I knew that when my before I knew that when my amygdala got hijacked that I needed to breathe. But breathe and do what? Breathe and say what to
Yeah,
myself? Breathe
right.
and
Right.
because my
You are
amygdala
always
is strong
looking
enough.
for the mystery. It sounds like
Yeah,
you're very conscious in your life of always looking for what's the most productive next step.
yeah, and my amygdala is strong enough that my
Yeah.
amygdala is like, okay, go ahead and breathe for 90 seconds, and then I'll bark again, kind of thing. You know, Yeah, so it's like, okay, what do I need to do while I'm breathing? And I needed to boil it down to the most simple thing that I could grab a hold of. And once
Hmm.
I got the word
Hmm.
control, once I
Hmm.
understood that about myself, then I know 90% of the time while I'm breathing, I can start saying, what's trying to control me and why am I afraid of this? Now,
Hmm.
it's not 100% of the time that that's it, but at least it slows
Yeah.
me down enough or my amygdala down enough that I can go, no, that's not it, but this is it.
Hmm.
So
That,
making
that's
it simple is key.
yeah, I think you're capturing it. It doesn't have to be super complicated. It's just a matter of you got to be able to stop and listen. This is happening, not freaking out. Freaking out is natural. It's totally normal. It's learning to overcome the freak out and then sitting with, oh, this is about fear. It's always about fear. What is my fear? And I like the simplicity of that because it's very easy to pivot to. You don't have to be super brainy smart to do it. You don't have to have a degree. It's just what am I afraid of? And that's the learning journey, I think.
Yeah,
I think it's really where we grow as human beings when we stop and we say, okay, I'm going to face this fear. Because here's the reality, if we don't face our fear, we miss out on life. It keeps us from life,
that's
you
exactly
know?
it. And
Yeah.
these days, what's really being of value to me and important to me about this work is I'm helping people discover the words to like the one thing that they're afraid of. Let's try to boil it down to one word. And I do that through personality profiles. It doesn't matter to me if it's Enneagram or Myers Briggs. It just doesn't matter to me which one. So happens to be the strength Clifton Strength Finders. I think is the most robust, but it helps once I give that gift to a person that
Mm.
this is the word, and they're the ones who select it, of course. The the tears that come to people's eyes,
Hmm. They can
like, oh
see.
my gosh, I can now control this.
Hmm.
I can have
Yep.
some sense of control. Like this one
Hmm.
lady was helping her. She was having some dealing with some problems at work and trust issues, and it came down to anybody. Her word is hope. Anybody who
Hmm.
attacks her hope,
Wow.
she's triggered. She just can't stand it, and she will bark and bite and
Hmm.
and uh, and it's having the tools, like I said, the tools are you have to mitigate distrust first, then you have to use relational tools to engage trust. And literally, Jonathan, the third thing is hone those tools and be prepared because it's going to happen again.
Hmm. Yeah,
Don't
that's the
quote.
nature of being a human being. Is your shit is going to recur. I wish that I was completely healed, and I know that I don't have the same fears, but I know that there's always shit that I have to work on. It's not
Right.
fun, but it is necessary in order for me to grow as a human being. I want to get back real quick to your book. You have a concept of the flywheel. Explain that. Trust
Yeah.
flywheel.
In fact, I just kind of explained it. So
Okay,
what
awesome.
came out of the research was that trust isn't really built and it really isn't
Mm.
earned. Trust is a gift.
Oh,
You give trust away.
oh.
No one should be transactional with trust.
Say that again. Say that sentence again because I think that's super important for people to understand. Because and it's blowing my mind right now.
Yeah, so trust it's not built. It's not like a
Right.
building. It's not you're the contractor of your trust. It's not that. It's not transactional. People don't earn trust. It's a gift. And when
Hmm.
you are able to figure that gift
Mm.
out, now I can engage in relational trust supposed like it's supposed to be, right? And so what I found was trust then is about building momentum. It's not a singular thing.
Hmm.
So if you and I have this history, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
so what I know is that over time we've probably not even recognized that this trust flywheel has engaged with us. So the
Hmm.
flywheel has three things. One is you have to mitigate distrust, and for me that means trust differently. Go from guard dog to guide dog. You're not trying to
Oh.
get rid of distrust. You're just trying to distrust differently. Then
Okay.
second is engage in uh, relational qualities. So engage with a person who, like you and I, we have a lot of things in common. We've been,
Hmm.
through shit in our lives. We work on ourselves.
Right.
We've been through divorce. We've lost everything in a minute. All
Right.
those things. Well, those we can recall those things and have engage in a trust because we both know things about each other without actually having to say those things,
Hmm.
right? And so here's the thing though is that once you start engaging in a relationship, that's risky business.
Hmm.
Do you know what
Yeah.
risk does? Is it inflames the amygdala.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it brings that all the way around. So it's mitigate distrust, engage in trust, be prepared for it to be tested because it's going to be tested because you just engaged in a relationship, and then mitigate distrust, and then engage trust, and then be prepared, and then mitigate. So the faster and more revolutions that flywheel can get, the the more robust it is and can't be knocked can't be halted so quickly.
And I think that's important, which, states that once you have a deeply developed flywheel going with someone and you're not having the pricks, the weekly pricks or whatever, because, couples can charge each other. There's enough inertia that keeps going because you're always adding to the good. So if something big happens, you probably still have enough to keep it going.
Yeah,
Whereas if you never get it going, you never get the benefit of it.
yeah, and
That's the problem with our amygdala is it keeps us every relationship you don't have, you don't get to experience.
that's
You
right.
know?
And
Yeah.
one of the problems, Jonathan, is that we have so focused on just one part of the flywheel, and that is mitigating distrust, that
Mm-hmm.
many couples have built their whole marriages around how do I mitigate distrust and never really use the tools to engage in trust.
But because they've told themselves they can't.
That's
I
right.
go back to your separation of the two empowers people because now they become two functions and they're in competition to each other, but they're not the same. And you once you know, oh, my amygdala is saying to my prefrontal cortex, don't trust. You still have the capacity to trust, but you've got to do the work.
You
Wow.
got to do the work.
This whole thing is blowing my mind. And I think because it's how do people deal with mental health? We are
Yeah,
I say to Rich all the time, we are in a mental health crisis because an entire generation of the world doesn't know how to be a human being anymore because it's so disconnected.
yeah,
And it's we need the trust between nations, cities, people, neighbors. It's what restores people.
that's right.
So I think this is probably one of the more important books. I hope 1 billion people read this because once you understand the nature of the relationship of the two, you can start participating in it. You know?
That's exactly it. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you
So
have to
what's the?
become aware.
I want to go back to my notes, but what is the last chapter? I feel like we got the that you sent me about.
I think
There's
we got to
4
all
points.
the things.
Did we
Say that
get to the
again.
4 points? Because I thought flywheel was the third one, right?
Yeah, the last one is how do personalities speed up. I think is what we talked about. So your
Okay.
personality basically defines the speed at which you distrust and trust. So there's a whole
Okay.
bunch of
Unpack
things out
that.
there that could trigger you and
Uh-huh.
don't because your specific personality really doesn't give a damn about them. But as
Okay.
soon as that one thing is or two things that are attacked or you perceive that they're being attacked, now the speed at which I'm going to distrust just went off the charts. And then I have specific
Okay.
qualities
Stop
that
for a
I
second.
yeah,
Stop for a second. Let me make sure that I understand what you're saying there. Is that it's when you feel like you're being attacked that distrust is magnified and inflamed. Is that what you said?
that's right. Yep. Because it's a response. It's a fight, flight, freeze response.
Mm-hmm.
We never, well, as far as I can find, no one's ever connected distrust with fight, flight, or freeze. It
Hmm.
it they've thought for a long time that it was just the opposite of trust, which I think most people would say, yeah, trust is a decision making process. I decide to trust people. So that's not really, I think,
Mm-hmm.
revolutionary. But what's revolutionary is,
Yeah.
but it's not the opposite. It's actually a response that the amygdala. So your personality pours into that as far as what kinds of things are going to speed up my distrust, and at the same time, because of my personality, there's things that I qualities in a person that I look for that are going to speed up my trust.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Give me an example.
So I'm an Enneagram. Let's not use Clifton Strength this time. Let's use Enneagram. I'm an Enneagram 8, wing 7. I am really attracted to an Enneagram 2 because they are the support system behind the power, right? Their whole thing, their whole reason for living is to give support and help. And
Mm-hmm.
an 8 doesn't want to be bogged down with details and but if someone comes along and is like, hey, I'll take that off your plate? Yes, sir. Let's do that. Where like an Enneagram 9, they're all about making peace. I can't
Okay.
stand Enneagram 9s because they get in my way. They
Really?
slow the process down. It's
Okay.
like, no, everybody doesn't need to get along. I just need to have victory. I need to conquer something.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
conflict is actually good to an Enneagram 8. We love conflict. So it's they're the personality types as they relate to one another. One of the things that you find out is there's relational qualities. It's not that I can't get along with nines. I have several nines
Mhm.
that are friends, but it takes a longer time for me to trust them. Where other personalities, it's like instant.
How do you uh Or let me ask this a different way. You've written a book on this concept. How has it changed the way you think about your own life?
I'm more graceful with myself,
Good.
and who knows if that's just the book or me turning
Hmm.
60
Well, you can't write a
or
book and not be affected by it. Yeah.
right.
You
Yeah. I
study the
mean,
concept of trust because I study trust because I needed to learn how to trust myself. That's the
right.
fact, you know?
That's the fact.
Yeah.
And same here,
Yeah.
right? It's just
Hmm.
um, I'm more generous with myself. I'm more generous with others. I hope.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's yeah. I mean, over the last what is it, 40 years um, that I've been working on this, it's taken 40 years for it to take some effect.
That's it's funny because I have on my phone and in my computer, I have probably 40. I started writing 40 years ago when I was about 16. And I've got everything, most of what I've written. And it's funny when you put it all together, it's really our thought process. 40 years is a long time of churning through an idea. And I resonate with it because I remember when I was young, learning that I couldn't trust myself. It's a weird thought. When I was 11, my parents divorced, and I went to camp, church camp, and I stole a wallet. And they had this massive search of our room because they were like, "Okay, what's going on?" And I remember going, God, why did I get myself into this? Because I wanted money. I stole $25 from my parents. They caught me, so I stole somebody else's wallet so I'd have money to have food at camp. And I just kept burying myself. And I realized my parents' divorce completely fucked me up. And I stopped learning how to trust myself. I was wounded. I was traumatized by what happened to me, but it was mostly self inflicted because it was really about how I felt about myself. That's the only judgment that matters. It didn't matter what
Okay.
anybody else thought, it mattered how I thought about myself. And I have also been on this 40-year journey of learning how to trust myself because you can't have life if you don't. That's what it comes
Yeah.
down to for me. I want to have an abundant life. It doesn't have to be Elon Musk. It just has to be me where I'm thriving. And you can't do
Yes.
that without trust. Yeah.
Exactly. And you and I have similar. My thing was my youth minister at around 10 said to me, and I didn't understand these words at the time, but he literally said to me, "Your family has a high competency in addictive forms of behavior. We're gonna stop it with you."
We're going to
And
what?
so we're gonna stop it with you. And
Oh, wow.
so he took me to Al-Anon meetings at the
Okay.
beginning,
Okay.
and so what I learned over the years in dealing with addictive forms of behavior is
Mhm.
addiction is all about not trusting yourself. Those
Yeah.
anyone who gets in the cycle of addiction and shame and guilt and
Mhm.
that whole cycle, all it is. Not, uh, I'm not
At the
trying to make
core,
it
at the essence,
at the
no, at the
core
core,
is
though, that's the
you just
simple.
don't trust
That's,
yourself. And going through the 12-step process for me is
mhm.
about learning to distrust myself differently. It's literally not
Mhm.
about trusting myself. It takes all 12 steps for me to understand I need to distrust myself differently. And because of that revelation, now I can begin to trust.
What do you want? I mean, obviously, it's going to be different for every person, but what do you want for your readers in reading this book? Like, what's the meaningful part behind it for you?
Um, just what we've probably been talking about is hopefully it can speed up the process. Hopefully
Hmm.
it's shorter than 40, 50 years for people like, who are smarter than me, who can figure out that
Hmm.
I can distrust myself differently. I can distrust others differently. And now I can build a life of an abundant life,
Hmm.
like you just said, built around trust. If that
Yeah,
happens, I'm totally satisfied.
that's beautiful. Do you have? your next book, or are you just going to wait for the next thing to pop in your head? Where's the next step for you? Because you and I have followed very parallel journeys, not just personally, but also kind of spiritually. We both were participating in the emergent church. In a nutshell, what attracted you to that space at that time? This is 2000. I think we met in 2008 or 9.
Yeah, I think that Tony Jones actually asked me kind of the same question the other day, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I felt. Let me just say it this way: I feel like my attraction was a little bit different than
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people heard the voice of the emergent church and said, "I'm not alone."
Mm-hmm.
Um, I never
Mm-hmm.
felt like I was alone,
Yeah,
but
neither did I. It was different for
I,
me too.
yeah, I really feel like that the emergent church brought validity to my voice,
Mm-hmm.
not really gave me a place where I was didn't feel alone because I never felt that way. I felt pretty comfortable in almost every religious circle.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed that since I was a kid, but hardly anyone would bring validity to my voice, and that's what it did for me.
Yeah, it was an interesting space because it was sort of a movement trying to survive with no money and a very wounded crowd. Because I think what attracted people to Emergent is the conversation which allowed them to express, I, like you said, feel alone. And I'm wounded, and I don't feel accepted even at my own church. Because it attracted a lot of people who were LGBTQ, and it was, how do we practice love in this new space? And that attract a lot of people from the mainline church, and it was just an interesting space because it was searching, I think, for an identity, and I don't know if it had one. It was a lot of people really focused on deconstruction without any reconstruction. And I think what I learned is I could never live forever in deconstruction. It was just like when you clean out the amygdala and when you clean out the negative energy, you got to rebuild.
You got
I,
it
I'm not a nihilistic person. That's never attracted me, and
right.
I want to maximize what I can do here, but I have to deal with myself first. So, um, where are
Yeah,
you at now?
when I
Or sorry,
watched
go ahead.
when I watched what was it called, the Jesus movement? What's
Hmm.
that Kelsey Grammer?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
the one that just came out.
yeah.
Uh,
So when I watched
Jesus
it,
culture.
the Jesus culture, that's it.
Yes.
When I watched it, I thought about the emergent church in this way. Um, I think that the movie was really honest about saying
Hmm.
the Jesus movement was birthed out of psychedelic drugs. And
Hmm.
that's just plain and simple fact, right? And in fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say psychedelic drugs probably saved Christianity in the US. Um,
Wow. Okay.
and I think the emergent church didn't use psychedelic drugs, but tried to
No.
find another platform, and that was mainly voice.
Hmm.
Different voicings of Christianity was kind of the drug that catapulted us into the movement we were.
Well, I think a lot of the ethos came out of Brian McLaren, who was just like, the man is gifted in heart, and he
Yeah,
set a tone that all are welcome. And
right,
that was exactly what really made Jesus culture so powerful. And I
right.
agree. Unpack a little bit for me the idea that psychedelics save Christianity. What do you mean by that?
Well, when
That's a
you look at
provocative statement.
yeah, when you look at Europe and where they're at with their Christianity in comparison to where we're at with our Christianity, and put them kind of on the same timeline, meaning adjusting timelines, we were on the same timeline as them as far as
Hmm.
the kind of the church declining in a way that
Right.
made it so unuseful for society and
Mm-hmm.
all those kinds of things, right? And so um, when the Jesus movement changed all of that,
Mm-hmm.
changed the trajectory of Christianity in the U.S. We wouldn't have, for instance, the Willow Creeks or the large congregations that we have without the Jesus movement.
Mm-hmm.
The Jesus movement would have never happened without psychedelic drugs. And
Okay.
the reason they took the psychedelic drugs is to find to find God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It wasn't quote unquote a drug movement. It was a search movement towards the divine in a way that they could only get through psychedelic drugs. So it's interesting to me that we probably wouldn't have the church the way it is without psychedelic drugs.
I think that's a very I think it's brilliant because you've tied the strings together because in hindsight what the psychedelic 60s culture was about peace and love. Like you can't get more Jesus centric, but what the church didn't like is they discovered it outside the church.
That's right.
But we're now it's kind of like when you said your book you found the data, the science supported your thought process. That same thing is happening now. We're beginning to learn that psychedelic plant medicines turn off the default mode network so you can see the unified field, which is what Jesus would call the kingdom of God. And then it gives you the physiological experience of it, of oneness. That's the outcome of it. It's just pure oneness. You belong. That's it. You belong.
That's right.
Start there. There is no exception. You belong. And now you've got a whole generation of kids that are making it's legal in Oakland. Like and it's
Right.
spreading. It's there you can go on tons of podcasts for smoking cannabis or anything that shuts down your amygdala and your default mode network. We are in a new age. And I think it's all coming together the same way, which is we're just discovering what's always been there that it's all energy. It's called the unified field, and you're part of it. So enjoy it. Like that's,
Right.
it's not rocket science. It's
No,
very, very simple. God, which is the unified field, wants us to, because it's an expression, each of us are an expression of that, wants us to enjoy this life. That's the purpose. Be fruitful and multiply. It's not rocket science. So that's
it's
why
not.
I appreciated all of those steps in the journey. I was never part of I was born in 67, so I never really got to experience the 60s. But I saw its aftermaths in the 70s and we felt a lot of that culture, but I felt heavy. I was when I was 10 years old, I went to I believe the first mega church in California. Los Gatos Christian, we were 7,500 people in 1975. I mean, it was like massive. We had 400 people in my junior high group and 800 in my high school group.
Wow.
And we were experiencing, and you know what the most powerful thing about it was, is that we were actually learning discipleship,
Yes.
primarily through serving people. That was it. We would pick a group of people, whether it was the prison, and everybody was doing it. And it was the most magnificent experience because I think we were supercharged by that whole history that was behind us. And then when we got to emergent church, it's like, oh, we're asking the really important questions again. Like, what is Jesus really trying to do? And are we crippled by our own theology? And then now, psychedelics are legal. It's a weird journey. It really is in terms of the whole way this has come about.
Yeah, it is. And just um, let me just say this: the scariest thing to establishments, let me say it that way, or
Mm-hmm.
institutions, is the ability to numb or get rid of the amygdala. And
Mm.
I don't actually think it's a good thing to get rid of the amygdala. I think it has
I
its
don't
purpose.
either. It
But
serves your body.
right, but it is the one thing that's the scariest about AI is AI doesn't have an amygdala. It just
Yes.
has a prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm. That is.
That's what's so scary about it.
Uh-huh.
And we're trying to build into it an amygdala. but
Well,
it's
as the science reveals how the brain works, they'll just copy it. So it's
yeah,
inevitable.
hopefully.
Like that's the tension. The more we discover what we are, the more we can learn to replicate it.
Right.
So, and like I said, I'm reading this book called Life 3.0 right now, and it talks about what are the outcomes of AI. Because I've always been fascinated. I've been in it. I worked for a company that was an AI company, and once you learn its capacity, it's immense. You learn it's like looking from the moon to the earth. It's like, holy shit, we don't really know what we have, but can we make it a good experience? And that's kind of what the book talks about, because the common thought is, hey, it's just going to be doomsday. No, that's not true. Most AI people think we're still 40 to 50 years at least from true AI.
Right.
But what we have now are really freaking smart subversions called
Right.
AGI, or
Right.
general intelligence. So its ability to organize is incredible, and we've never seen it. I think it's going to level the playing field tremendously. But
Yeah.
like
No,
back to what you said is, we now know, so they'll copy it.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Joseph, this has been one of my funnest episodes, probably because I've known you for so long. And this concept is really at the very core of my heart, learning to trust myself.
Mm,
Thank you for writing the book. Uh, many billions of people need to learn how to trust. And
mm,
imagine if we did. So thank you for being part of that conversation, because there's a lot of people out there that want to learn how to trust, and they need tools like this. It may be a new field in the study of trust, but it's one that's most worthwhile, I think. So thank you
mm.
for doing that.
Well, thanks for having me on, and it's been so fun catching up with you. Uh,
Absolutely.
especially just riffing through thoughts. It's so fun to do that with you, Jonathan.
That's kind of the way I think. That's why I started this podcast. Is I know, so I'm ADHD, or at least that's kind of what I'm wondering. I have this, my brain has a million thoughts in it, so I tend to jump.
Yep.
Uh, but I'm always enjoying. I've learned to really enjoy the conversation, because the more that here's the what I'll close with. The more we learn, my life has probably been now about 10 to 15 years of really practicing actively to trust myself. It's worth it. It's worth taking that journey, because the more we do, the more we can enjoy the life we are living.
Yeah.
When you trust yourself, you don't have to worry about all the defense mechanisms you've created. You can tear them down, and you prepare yourself, because remember, 84% of what you worry about never happens anyways. So you lose 4/5 of your life to a physical process, and you're exhausted all the time, where I am. And I just couldn't live that way anymore. So take the risk of trust. Joseph, thank you, brother.
Yeah.
You're
Thank
awesome.
you. Amen.
All right, this has been a truly a wonderful episode of Living in the Matrix. Again, if you listen, please review, comment, share your thoughts, what you'd love to hear. If you want to introduce us to anybody, we'd love to have you do so. Much love, everybody. Take care.